What?
There you are, in the dark. Might throw out some paper clips and
Yep.
it would free up a yogurt container.
Yeah, we have a bunch of those too, though. But I agree, we have too many little ones. I don't know if I want to give them to Nate, or I don't know who else needs them. Or this is the pattern we don't want to get into. It doesn't matter if somebody needs them.
First of all, let me tell you how sorry we are for your loss.
Morning, Susie.
Good morning, George. How are you?
I'm good. How you doing?
I'm doing okay.
What's that noise in the background?
Oh, I was banging. I won't bang anymore.
It sounds like somebody's got a radio on.
Oh, yeah, actually, that's true. That background. Can you turn it down a little bit, Walter?
Or the TV on.
No, we don't have a TV. But that radio is all the way in the other room, so it must mean it's pretty sensitive. Listen.
Oh, you know what it is? It might be me. Actually, I might have clicked on YouTube by mistake.
Oh,
Oh, yeah, it is me. Oh, that's pretty funny. I accuse you.
yeah.
Sorry about that.
No, that's okay.
So,
Did you find that? You can turn it up. It wasn't us.
I apologize.
That's all right. Did you find any of that information enlightening?
Not enlightening as much as just reminding, bringing me back up to speed mostly,
Yeah.
which is really what I needed to do. Like yesterday when yesterday when you asked the question, how's the statutory work? And kind of got an opportunity for myself to be reminded how that works.
Yeah.
How it works.
Yeah.
I don't know if you found that helpful or not.
Well, it's interesting the way my mind has not cleared this. And I want to mention that Les Luchanik is probably going to log on.
Okay.
It's just a public meeting. And I haven't got it in my head yet. So when I talked to Becky, her framework didn't make sense to me. So we'll go over it together with AJ when he's here.
Yeah, I read your email, reading your email yesterday, clearly that wasn't a real productive meeting. I mean, Becky's really smart and she totally gets it. So, but I could tell that you were still a little confused. So I thought maybe in a graphic, a table to illustrate it would bring it into light.
Well, I had read through the 2015 report and I had notes that asked some questions, but I thought I had an understanding, and then that was not the understanding I got from Becky. So I think it's remarkable to me, looking at all these notes, the way words are not used consistently. And so the word statutory, it's as if it's a monolith. It's as if it's a fixed thing. But even when she was talking to me about it, she uses the word statutory twice in the sentence, not having the same meaning. So it's like, oh boy. And then I went and looked. Oh, here's AJ. Sorry.
Well, there's statutory, and then there's versions of the statutory. There's modifications to the statutory. So you have to be clear. If you read the, wait for AJ to get on.
Yeah. Hey there, AJ.
Good morning, AJ.
Good morning. Yep. He's off.
Good morning.
Good morning. So where do we want to start? I thought the timeline approach is really helpful because it is about an evolving understanding that changed over time. And so that is very helpful.
My question would be is, I first like to make sure we have a very clear goal for this committee before we decide how we're going to move forward. I think I understand what we're trying to do, but if you could just clarify what the goal of this committee is.
Okay. So one of the things that was happening for me is people's using terms of what we've agreed to, where we're trying to go to, all that did not seem, I didn't have the background that made me feel like this is an agreed upon perception. And so when we went to the 4 towns, clearly it wasn't agreed upon. So I felt like if we're gonna try to work anything out, we need to go in there with a very substantiated, fact-based understanding of what the history is and where we're trying to go. So in order to do that, I needed to look back through everything and I needed to find a way to present it. I will say that Becky did not talk to Andy Steinberg again, but
Okay.
she did talk to Mike Morris, and he said Amherst is in total disarray. I think it was the town council came back and said they need those cuts in the school budget, and it should really be a $2 million cut. And Mike's like, holy moly. So he's trying to figure out how to address Amherst also. And I feel we actually didn't even get the opportunity to say that Shutesbury did not support the $1.4 million cut. And I wish we had said it. We can still say it. And he is under duress. And it occurred to me that we've had 2 superintendents, multiple finance committee members changing over the time of this agreement, 2 financial directors, and I believe there is not a clear understanding of what the history says and where we want to take it from here. So that's what I'm trying, and then add 13 new members from the council. That like we have 7 members on our FinCom and 3 select board members, and they all have some history. They ended up with 13 new people, some who have history, but a lot who don't. And he was trying to deal with some of the misinformation that was passed at that meeting. So I feel like we need to have a very firm footing. And I feel people that come to our meetings need to hear a firm footing, a firm idea of what the word statutory means, what 100% statutory is versus the
5-year rolling
where
average
we are.
minimum contribution, which is
So-
what we're doing now.
Yeah. So that's what I'm coming to. When we get something that is understandable by us and then the rest of the FinCom, then I believe it's part of what we take back to the next 4 town meeting negotiation. But many of the notes showed the effort to communicate with the other towns, other select boards, other finance committees. It's not clear how well that worked. And we, in fact, did not go ahead and talk to the 4 towns before we went to the 4 town meeting. And so we walk in to a room where, things sort of fall apart pretty quickly. So I think the PR has to be improved. The communication has to be improved.
Well, the 4 town meeting is, I'm sorry, AJ.
No, go ahead. I was gonna make
No,
a
I was going
different
to say the
point.
4 town meeting is the opportunity we have to talk to the 4 towns. I mean, that's the purpose of it.
But-
Otherwise, anything else is just communication through back channels, and that just becomes political. I'm
Well,
not saying that doesn't happen. It probably does.
except for sometimes in the history, it was clear that the committee agreed they should send out the information we're working from to all of the players, the FinComs, the select board, and the regional school committee, that you don't have to come into that meeting cold. You can come into the meeting with a published document that everybody got, and then you can have a reference point. I don't believe most people read what they get. It's too hard as volunteers to keep up, but at least they could have some papers in front of them. And it wasn't clear to me how much information the superintendent or the financial director got before the meeting from the towns in terms of their positions.
Yeah, I guess I think everything you said makes sense to me, Susie. The piece that I would add to it is that I think, one of the things I learned coming out of that meeting, the 4 towns meeting, is that we had work to do just in terms of kind of public education around these issues. And what disturbed me was this, the sort of lack of any kind of framing or understanding of the statute or any history of the statutory method as an effort to make this process fair and equitable to all communities.
Mhm.
And in the absence of that understanding, it
Mhm.
becomes very sort of easy and even kind of lazy to just fall back on, well, isn't the fairest approach to just charge every town based on every child costing the same amount of funds, and so one of the things that I've personally felt a little frustrated with is that I didn't feel like was armed with a lot of the sort of history and information for understanding how this method was created to begin with. And I think I still need, like, beyond our community, I think we would benefit from more understanding and information and documentation about the creation of this method to begin with, and what were the compelling arguments that led the state to develop this method. And so I'd love for that to be part of this, because I think at some point, yes, we need to have a document that we can, a fact sheet of sorts that we can share with communities that lays all of this out. Kind of this, what really is statutory, what is the history of our four towns kind of grappling with incorporating this method into how we assess towns, and also what is the history that around what created statutory to begin with.
Mhm. And that's what Becky latched onto right away. And so she's going to the DESE and getting
Mhm.
a rep to come out, and she's using Mike Morris to do it. And that's part of where her conversation down with Mike Morris was like, oh my God, this is a
Yeah.
mess. And so I'm not sure. I know she had, like, the guy that used to do it, Roger Hatch, is retired. They have
Mhm.
identified who will do this, a guy named
Okay.
Rob something. And I don't know what the time frame is, if they've gotten a time frame yet. But yes, and that authority, rather than Shutesbury, who has a bad guy hat in this, if that authority
Yeah.
explaining the history should give us all the same page. And then I feel like the FinCom's job, once it understands this and can represents it to our own citizens, as well as to sit with the other towns and do it too.
Mhm.
Because we have a lot of push from our citizens, and we need to be able to address that.
And we probably will, no matter what, because the statutory is always going to look like the best, and they're going to ask, why are we not taking full advantage of the statutory? I mean, it's going to be a hard sell to the community, given the feedback we've been getting. There is a parent constituency here, of course, who's going to see the bigger picture, and that is, how much damage do we want to inflict on the budget overall? That's been the balancing. I know you both know this part. That's been the balancing act all along with all of this, is not dragging the other three towns into the statutory method, knowing that would crush the budget.
Right.
They couldn't, Amherst couldn't have achieved that full increase in 1 year. Just to follow up on AJ, your comments, those are excellent. I think you really framed it for me on what we need to do here. I was frustrated by that four-town meeting because we had because Andy Steinberg clearly did not bring his town up to speed. And it appeared to me like that was by design, and almost that he wanted everybody to keep saying 5-year rolling average, the most fair, as a negotiating point for him. That's a negotiating place that he wanted to start. So I was frustrated by that, because those people were making strong arguments for the most fair method, which certainly one of our jobs is to dispel that myth. And then the second thing about all those conversations, I want to make it clear for everyone, we went through this whole evolution of meetings and reports over and over, and we came to an agreement 3 years ago. And that agreement was, and Andy's right, that agreement was for 2 years, we would use the 5-year rolling minimum contribution statutory method, the one we're using now, and we would go from 30 and then to 40 in 2 years. We ended up going from to 30 in year 1 and 45 in year 2. And Andy's right, there was not a plan or an agreement of any sort to go beyond that.
Right.
So, you know, I just wanted to get that out there because that is true. Andy didn't say we're going to just keep doing this till we get to 100%. Amherst said that for 2 years, we're okay with moving in this direction. And that's consistent with the email that he sent to Becky, which said, you know, I'd like to find a midpoint in all of this because either end of the spectrum, the 5-year rolling average or the statutory, are both extreme methods because there are towns that get really hurt with one or with the other. And getting to the midpoint narrows those gaps in what a town is assessed under either method, and it becomes more palatable. And Eric and myself have always been kind of a proponent of a 50-50 method. At this point, the position Shutesbury is taking, I'm not sure we can stop at 50-50.
Well, so that's the part I need to understand. The S10 solution was called 50-50. So that means, does that mean 50% of the assessment is based on minimum contribution and 50% of the assessment is based on enrollment number? Is that what that means?
First of all, don't pay any attention to S10 because it was soundly, you know, it was decided not to, we decided not to go with it. But a 50-50 hybrid method is very simple. It says we take 50% of, let's say $20 million is what's going to be assessed to each town. We take, or 30 million, whatever. The amount to be assessed to the towns, 50% of that amount is assessed each town based on a 5-year rolling average. And then the other 50%,
5-year rolling average of enrollment.
the legacy method that we've been doing since the region started. So if it's a $30 million assessment, we take 15 million and we calculate each town's assessment of 15 million based on a 5-year rolling average. And then the other 15 million, 50%, we calculate on using the statutory method. And then each town's amount under 50% of statutory and 50% of the 5-year rolling average are added together, and that's what a town is assessed. So it's just taking half the budget, half the assessment, and allocating that half by the 5-year rolling and half by the statutory, and then adding the two together for each town to get each town's assessment.
Okay, so this 50% from the 5-year rolling average of enrollment numbers, and then 50% is broken into two parts. Minimum set. The second 50% is called statutory, which breaks it into minimum contribution and 5-year rolling average of enrollment.
For 99% of it, yes.
I think there's even a third component, which was for the capital expenses in the budget. That has, I guess that by law, that has to be apportioned based on the EQV, right? So there's actually 3 components to that.
That's right. Under the statutory, there's 3 components. That's correct.
Yeah.
Okay, so when there is an urgency to keep moving this towards what's called 100% statutory, what out of those components would be different?
If I may, Susie, I would just like to stop you right there, first of all. So what I just described to you was a 50-50 method using 50% statutory and 50% 5-year rolling average.
Mm-hmm.
All right, 2 methods. But now the towns have agreed that instead of using a full statutory method, or the standard statutory method, that remember, what was it, 68% of it is based on minimum contribution. Mm-hmm. And what the towns decided 2 years ago, and everybody seems to still like, is instead of using the current year's minimum contribution, using a 5-year rolling average of the minimum contribution.
Okay.
So that's the method we're actually using in fiscal 21, where 45% of the assessment is calculated using that method, and 55% of the amount to be assessed is calculated on the 5-year rolling average. So pretty close to the same thing I just described, except that the statutory method has a modification to it.
Okay, I'm not going to get in the weeds on this. I'm going to, so Um,
I think your point though, Susie, is that even the statutory method has a component and will always have a component that is based on strict
enroll.
Enrollments.
average enrollment. Yeah. Yeah. So that is true. And my perception is that that is not a point that is understood by many people.
Right.
I think most people assume that when they hear the statutory method, that means 100% of that calculation is going to be based on some wealth factors.
Right.
Isn't that your sense of it?
Yes.
I mean, except for folks like George who, have been involved in these discussions deeply for, a while, but I don't sense that that's a well understood point.
Right.
Bob understands it. He brings it up in our meetings. Yeah.
Yeah.
So case in point, if that's 68%, if the statutory method or the 5-year rolling minimum contribution method, if 68% of that is based on ability to pay, and then we go 50-50, then you're really only getting, right, half of that, 34% of your assessment is based on ability to pay, and the rest is enrollments.
Right.
I think that can be a compelling argument when we're talking to the other towns.
I agree. So I just had 2 additional points I wanted to kind of throw out there. One is that I did not really fully appreciate until both the 4 towns meeting and the budget hearing that I watched after the fact about sort of how disruptive and how much of a problem this whole process is for the district.
Yeah.
The unpredictability, the way in which it seems like it is so difficult for the district to come to terms on what its budget is going to be because of the not knowing where this negotiation is going to land. And so I don't think I appreciated that until now. And that, to me, that becomes one of the kind of critical sort of factors that I think has to kind of guide these discussions, which is really about like, we need to get to a place, an agreement that can be in place for the foreseeable future, that the district can count on and rely on as they're developing budgets each year. And that seems like a much more important outcome of this process than I think I understood beforehand. So that's one point. Second point is that, I think in retrospect, I think Amherst might have been prepared to accept the 55% method going into that 4 towns meeting. It kept them within that 1.5% guidance that they had given the district. It almost seemed like it was the budget sheet was, the spreadsheet was sort of created to kind of to ensure that method was going to fall within the Amherst guidance. So I think we're already sort of beyond the 50-50 notion, because I think they were probably ready to do 55% this year. And so I think we've already sort of moved past the strict goal of getting a method that's going to land at 50% statutory, 50% rolling average. I did personally feel like, having heard particularly that budget hearing, that led me to kind of a new scenario that I think I would be personally kind of comfortable with, which is actually looking at the 75% number as an outcome that is that I'd be kind of willing to live with, particularly if it came with like a long-term expectation that we're going to stay there for the foreseeable future and maybe going 55 this year, 75 for next year and beyond. Uh, um, to me, that sort of felt like, in Andy Steinberg's sense of like finding a middle ground. If one end of that range of possible options is 100% statutory, and the other end is essentially 50-50, which they're sort of already at right now, a kind of midpoint between those two options does seem to be the 75% statutory. I don't think they're prepared to do that this year, but if we did a two-step process of like 55 this year, 75% for next year and beyond, personally, I don't know if our colleagues, I don't know if you guys are comfortable with that. I don't know if our colleagues are. I don't know if the rest of our town would be comfortable with that. But it does strike me as kind of a reasonable compromise, just to kind of throw that scenario out there. Although it is clearly different from what the position that we've communicated beforehand.
Just for your information, if we went to the 0.75 method, then 50% of the assessment would be based on ability to pay, because that's 68%.
Right, there you go.
Right on the number, right on the money.
Right.
So, and that's a selling point for Andy.
Right.
There's your 50-50, Andy.
So can
Right.
you stop for a minute and take me through a 0.75? So at 0.75, then do we also say the word 25? Is it 75, 25, or we just start off by saying 75%?
It's 75-25. 75% of the assessment would be calculated on a statutory with a 5-year rolling minimum contribution, and 25% would be calculated on a 5-year rolling average of it.
Okay, and then in the 75% on statutory, it uses a 5-year rolling average minimum, and you're saying that equals 50%.
That's so the 5-year rolling minimum is 68% of that method. 75% of that comes out to 50%, 51. So the result is the overall formula will result in 50% of the assessment being based on, ability to pay.
Okay, so does the minimum contribution stay, is that the fixed figure at 68%? So somehow I thought that would be a variable, but you're saying no.
It varies within each town,
Okay,
but at the whole high level assessment level, the full assessment to all 4 towns, it's broken by 3 components, 68, 31, I forget now, and 1, I think is the way it looked. I'd have to pull up the spreadsheet.
okay. All right, so then the 5-year rolling average minimum contribution, which is 68%, if we're using a 75% formula, that equals 51% of our total assessment comes from that area. And then 25 comes from the 5-year rolling average enrollment.
Right. So if we have $20 million to assess to the towns, 15 million of it will be assessed based on the minimum contribution method. And then each town will have an assessment of the 15 million, and then the remaining 5 million, 25% of the assessment, that would be calculated on a 5-year rolling average, and each town's amount would be added to what we calculated in the first step.
So I'm sorry. So
I could walk you
of
through it
the
if you
75% that's statutory, 68% is the minimum contribution, and that will, because we're using 75%, that'll be 51% of the total. And the other part of that is the enrollment, and then there's just the enrollment part. I just don't figure it out.
right.
Yeah, I think you've got it, Susie. The statutory or minimum contribution method has 3 components to it, and one of those components is enrollment. And so the end result of this 75% method, this purple column on the the spreadsheet that we've been looking at, that the end result is that half of that boils down to ability to pay factors, and half of it comes from strict enrollment factors. And so I think you understand it. Yeah. I think so.
And I'll work on that piece, but the other thing is it's what I'm thinking about is what is the push to continue the idea of getting to 100%? It's like, why is that even why is it even out there? Why aren't we finding a formula that is workable and fair, balanced, and it's almost like 100% is a number that people know, and like it means you get an A. It's like, no, there's nothing about that is intrinsically the right place to be. It's easy to say, it's what we all do in grade school, but I can't see why we have to even be talking or representing that. And I don't see it in the agreements or discussions. I don't see a firm agreement on this anyways across the district. So if we pick something, it seems to me we have to represent it. It has to show some reasonable numbers, and it's not it can be, like you're saying, if we go to 75, it's from there forever. We're not trying to do something different. It becomes the way,
Right.
Instead of using these other numbers to beat us up and say, well, you overpaid by $2 million. It's like, no, stop.
Right.
That's using a different measure.
I don't think there's any question.
I think there's a couple of things that have contributed to this climate where it seems like to many people, any settling for any other option other than 100% statutory is a kind of a bad outcome for Shutesbury. I think one of those factors is that I do think there is a misunderstanding even within our committee about this notion of a default statutory method, that if we can't agree, so that if we can't come to an agreement with the other towns, we're going to automatically end up at statutory, which is ultimately the best outcome for Shutesbury anyway. So we have all this leverage in this process because it's the onus is on the other towns to kind of come to an agreement with us, because if they can't do that, then they're going to end up where we want to be anyway. So that is a misunderstanding that I think is actually fairly prevalent in our community. And I think part of what this committee can do is, like, once and for all, present clear facts about what the process is. There's even a misunderstanding about how, well, we can pass the budget in all of our town meetings and just disagree about the statutory method. And so then we're going to end up with the same budget for the region, and we're just going to grapple with different ways to assess it. That's clearly not the case. I mean, if one town does not approve the assessment method, the budget is killed, right? So even that piece of information is not well understood. And so I think that's part of what's going on, I think, and contributes to this understanding that we have enormous leverage to and that anything less than 100% statutory is a compromise that we shouldn't and don't need to make. So I think that's part of it. I do think there's also another piece out there, and I think like, to me, this is very well expressed by like some members of the school committee, like Dan, which is that who I think tends to argue for 100% statutory because it is, an equitable approach to ensuring that, towns are assessed fairly. So I do think there's kind of a segment of our community that argues for 100% statutory because they believe, I think in many ways fairly and appropriately, that it is the fairest method. And so that is what we should be fighting for and advocating for. So I think there's sort of like two, kind of like two sort of pockets of kind of voices out there that aren't exactly saying the same thing as one another, but they're both, I think, contributing to this climate where it's like, we've gotta accept, nothing less than 100% statutory.
So if it was 100% statutory, it would be that 68% would still come from,
So may I stop you there?
Yeah.
Because I was mistaken. I just went and looked at the spreadsheet. It's 61%. So it's 61% is minimum contribution, 38% is enrollment, and then there's the 1% for the asset. So in AJ, I said 75% was 51. It's really 46% of the overall assessment would be based on the minimum contribution. 46.
Okay.
To get it to 50, actually 49. If we use the 80-20, 80% instead of 75, then we'd be at just at 50, just under it.
I see.
But anyways, yeah, I wanted to correct myself on that because I should never go by memory.
so 100% statutory would only use 61% minimum contribution, 38% using enrollment number for 5-year rolling average, and 1% for capital.
Well, the standard statutory method, the straight statutory method uses enrollment, current year enrollment, not a 5-year rolling enrollment. Right. So that's another tweak. When you say you said earlier, the terms we use are so important. But just, we just got the Rotown paper, the Shutesbury paper this week, and the select board said, we're moving towards 100% statutory. The select board has never said that. The select board said we're moving to 100% 5-year rolling minimum contribution method. So again, the misinformation, and that makes a lot of people happy because that's what people want to see. So now they got it on record that that's what the select board said, which is a little disappointing.
But all of our records can be retracted. I'm not worried about what we've said, and I'm not worried about what they've said. I want to come out of this.
I'm only concerned about that when we're in the public forum and people come out and say, look at what the select board said, because that's what's going to happen, Jeff. People are going to do that.
So the preface to the whole thing is the words have been used too loosely. These concepts have qualifiers, and we will be more careful to put the qualifier. So the whole 5-year rolling average and phasing in by 5 years, those have gotten melded together. It's like, no, those are two separate fives. But oh well, there it goes.
Yeah, I think the spreadsheet that the district used at the 4 towns meeting labels our 5-year rolling average minimum contribution as the modified statutory method, and I think that's the kind of cleanest way for us to. It's on this, the disc on the spreadsheets that all 4 towns look at every time we meet. So I think it's a good idea for us to. It's also less of a mouthful. It's just modified statutory method.
We all cut corners because we have something to say and we don't want to spend 30 seconds describing the method.
Yeah.
Well, one thing I'll just say about the modified method, that's fine, but we have to be careful because we're going to be talking about a lot of different modified methods.
Yes.
So I think we're always going to have to kind of put in the description of what that method is.
Right.
It's unfortunate. AJ, I don't know that the question of is the default to statutory a question that's really been answered? It's been debated and nobody seems to really know. And I think it's one of the questions that does need to be resolved when DESI is here. When they're meeting with the towns, they need to tell us that. I will tell you, when Roger Hatch met with us, he looked at us and said, I don't know why you guys just don't go to the statutory. I mean, his attitude was, we made this formula because it's right, it's accurate, it's the best way to go. Why wouldn't you guys just do it?
So I will say this, I don't know if you viewed this part of the budget hearing, but this did come up at the budget hearing. And what Mike Morris said is, and he referred to a memo that they did get. So they have written response from
From
DESE, yes, when this came up, whatever it was, a year or two ago. And the way he described it in the budget hearing is that if one or more towns votes down its assessment, the recommended assessment method, the DESE will kind of control the budget. They will determine what the total budget amount is. And the way he described it is, he said, if it represents a reasonable increase from the prior year, they will allow that amount. I think he said within 1% or something. So obviously that's not relevant here because they're flat. They've essentially got a level funded budget here. But in any event, this is how he described it. DESE will make a determination about what's an appropriate total budget amount, and will put the district on a with this 12-1 budget. They'll divide that amount by 12 amounts, and they will give, I think he did use the 6-month time frame. He said they will give district the region an additional time to negotiate and come up with, but that is different than saying, this is the assessment is going to default to 100% statutory.
But one more piece of that frame is that the 1/12 budget is then assessed to the towns at statutory method.
Yes,
and
not our modified statutory. It will be the statutory method. Yeah.
Right. And 6 months to straighten it out. And actually, Becky sent me the DESE memo. I didn't remember that. I can send it to you.
Yeah, I think it'd be great.
And
to
it's
look at
from,
that.
from 2010 and 2020. And then the other piece is that Mike Morris, when he was talking to Becky, said he's called down to DESE to get answers, and depending on who you talk to, you get different answers. I know that's true when I was doing town clerking stuff. It's just the truth. It's not that people, and so he was feeling frustrated, and he also said, therefore, the answer Jeff Lacey once got for some of the questions he asked, it's not a firm deal because it just depends on who answered the phone or how they understood the question or what parts they cited.
Or
so
how Jeff interpreted the answer.
Yeah. And then it was interpreted. So it's so Mike was feeling really frustrated from all angles.
Yeah, I mean, to me, one thing that does seem sort of non-controversial to say this is that this is not an appropriate way for a school administration to manage its finances. So even that scenario, even if we assume that it does put us on a path that leads to a better quote unquote outcome for Shutesbury, this is not like a healthy way for a school administration to manage its budget. Like, we should not be sort of proceeding with these negotiations or this process thinking that that's that's a good outcome because it's going to get us to statutory, and that's what we want, and so great, right? No, it's not great. It's actually not a good way for the district amid all of the problems it's grappling with right now. This is not a good way for a school system to do its kind of critical sort of manage its finance function, right?
Well, and I think one of the worst parts of it, and Mike Morris talked about it at that budget hearing on February 9th, at 57 minutes, he goes into this thing, and it's like, are we even here to talk about educational services this budget's trying to yield? Nope, we go right to this other thing, spend a lot of time and come up with answers that don't appreciate or support a budget that serves children. And so when can we get off of that thing and start talking about serving children and our support to do that? And one of the things
Right.
I didn't understand is that when in the history, Leverett said, okay, we're not going to sign that. Go ahead, turn it to statutory. And Marie said it'll be a $1.8 million cut. So they've pulled that card, and they pulled it to sort of say, see how stupid that choice is? It creates a huge cut in the budget. And that piece hasn't been talked about. I think people think that's a punitive response from Amherst, that it's just a card being played. But in fact, they have limits to how much elasticity they have to allocate into education. That's why I copied that one piece out of the handbook that says you have to reflect your new growth, increased revenues in your school budget. You have to allow
Yeah, that was interesting.
a portion of that. And so like, well, Amherst must be having a lot of new growth. So they
Where's that
should.
from?
It's from the handbook. It's from the Association of Town Finance Committee.
Oh, I'll have to look at that. I wasn't aware of that. That's good to
Yeah.
know.
I wasn't either. So when I was looking through the different sections and got to school, that was like, whoa, that applies to us too. And so we just had some new growth with the solar project. Did some of that money get reflected in our increase into the school budget? In this town right now, those revenue increases are being used to drive down the tax rate. It's like, whoop, that doesn't work. But I wondered if in somehow the formula that the state uses for aid or something, I don't know. I don't know where that appears. But Amherst must be really in the thick of that because they have a lot of new growth. So I sent you the comparison of the percentages of each area of the budget that towns are spending, and you can see it's incredibly consistent from year to year, and in each town we sort of maintain. But Amherst being 9% behind us in education spending, and then having all this new growth, it's like, why can't the answer not be, we're going to cut your budget by 2 million? Why can't the answer be some of the new growth and some of our levy is going to go to increasing our percentage of what we spend in our town on schools? But we can't tell them how to do this, but we can be aware of, you can't put them up against something that can't work. You can't say you must increase your portion, but we can see the possibility. I think I don't understand how the discrepancy between our contribution to education at 63% and theirs at 52%. Like, how does that work? And how can they change that?
Yeah, I saw that. I mean, I think that what jumped out to me was that they spend as a proportion much more on police functions than the other towns do. Maybe that shouldn't surprise me, but yeah.
Their
I would expect-
population demands that. Their population is huge to student. So I get that. I get why it would be different, but it is actually in the arguments that are going on right now when citizens are writing in, they're talking about cutting the police budget and putting it into schools. Well, yeah.
Right.
Well, that's the environment we're in right now anyways, that's going to happen. But the reality is when the kids are back at school, they're going to be breaking up the Hobart hoedown again, and they're going to need those officers. I don't know how much they can really save on their school budget. I mean, on their police budget. Optically, they're probably going to have to do something.
Yeah.
But actually, I was really impressed by the percentages. They all make total sense to me. And the fact that we were so close to the other three towns, the only one we were hiring was the fixed. But that's because we are funding the library and putting in a portion, about 125,000 into that service. We always leave it in there. So that made total sense to me. And it was encouraging to see how close we are to the other towns, because a lot of the pressure that we get to go to the statutory comes from members who say our budgets are too high in all our departments. And when we look at it the way you looked at it, Susie, we look very consistent.
Yeah.
Our budgets are not fat. There's no way.
Right. And the other
Yeah.
piece I didn't know is where the health insurance sits. In our regional budget, we see the cost of the health insurance for the regional school. Is that right?
My computer kicked out for a second. Could you just repeat the first part of that?
So when we get a regional school budget, it includes the health insurance for the staff,
Yeah.
right? And teachers.
I've seen that before. Yep.
But
I think it was broken out in the last slide.
yeah, but our local school budget doesn't include our health insurance in that number.
The school, but our local school budget doesn't have health insurance in that number.
Right. So it's interesting to think about how these numbers are not exactly consistent. So we would guess that the regional school budget could have a bigger increase because it includes health insurance. Our local school budget doesn't include the health insurance, so we're not going to see the problems with health insurance reflected in that number. They come in somewhere else, and we don't have to talk about that as a school thing.
Right, and that's true for other things like OPEB.
Yeah, that's in the regional school budget. So OPEB and health insurance are in the regional school budget. Well, those are pretty wild card numbers. They've been for us. They impact our
big
budget
numbers.
increases. Yeah. So
Yeah.
we're gonna, that's gonna change how their increases look. That is not about staffing teachers in classrooms. That's about managing a business, a
Right.
system.
No, I think, Susie, your larger point, and you made it earlier in the conversation too, is an important one, which is that however these negotiations play out, I don't think we want to be sort of put in this position where our advocating for a method that's either the modified statutory or closer to it. We don't want to be in a position where other towns can see that as reflecting a lack of support for the budget overall and for our town's support of education services. And I think we are a little vulnerable, and it started to happen in that four towns meeting where it's like our pushing for what we view as a fairer assessment method is going to force cuts in services. And I think we need to be able to sort of push back against that argument whenever it's made. And I think even saying something along the lines of, we would support a budget, an operating budget that has, well, we didn't get to say it, but didn't have that $1.4 million cut. But I think we could even say, I certainly feel this way, that I would support an overall operating budget that has less than $1 million cut. I would be very supportive of any effort to reduce that even further. And that because we are advocating for an assessment method that we view as fairer to our citizens, our town, does not mean that we don't support a robust budget for the district. And I think that we haven't actually said that to the other towns, or haven't said it loudly enough.
From the very beginning, and the problem is there's not a lot of people with history here because there has been turnover, but this all started in 2012, 13, but in 2015, we said, we think we need to go to a fair method where Shutesbury can get some help and get some of the aid that is meant for Shutesbury, because we need it. We can't do the 5-year rolling average. Everybody needs to know, because we'd be at $25, and they do.
Right.
We came out and said, we think that it has to happen in steps. We understand that we can't just move to the statutory. We do not want to destroy the budget. We do not want it. We said all those things. We've been saying them all along. We try to avoid looking like the bad guys here as much as we can, but people need to understand. I mean, that's the point of this meeting, is we want everybody to understand what's the right method and why it's the right method.
Right.
People are going to appreciate when they understand that Shutesbury is supporting Amherst, because 80% of the aid that is set for us is going to Amherst under the 5-year rolling average. The aid we get, I don't know what the best way to put this is, but
Mhm.
the difference between the method we use and the statutory method, that gap that we're paying and not having our assessment lowered by,
Mhm.
is all 80% of that is going to Amherst, because they get 80% of they pay 80% of the regional assessment. So the aid that we don't get is subsidizing Amherst. That really rubs a lot of people in Shutesbury wrong. How is it that I drive through Amherst Woods and I see these houses and I'm giving them my money?
Mhm.
That's an argument we're always going to face as far as the people who want 100% statutory. That said, I diverge there, but my point is, AJ, we certainly have done that. And I will tell you this, Eric Nakajima was on the last working group with me,
Mhm.
Andy, Julie Shively most of the time, but she was sick a couple times and it was Tom, and then of course, Sean Magano and Michael. And Ed said to me, he says, I got to tell you, Ed Nakajima was the head, the chair of the regional school committee. I
Mhm.
really appreciate what you've done. I really appreciate the tact you guys have taken and the fact that you're not trying to shove anything down our throat and are working with us. And that's a message. I don't know if anybody has that
Mhm.
perspective anymore. It was
Yeah.
great that he did, and I was sad when he left
Mhm.
because I knew we lost an ally there.
Mhm.
So I want to go back to the idea, to play out the card of, say we put in our pitch for do not cut the budget $1 million. If
Mhm.
it's not cut $1 million, what does Amherst do with their portion? How do they meet their assessment if it's not cut down more?
They say they can't. I mean, you just told me that
Yeah.
they're telling
Right.
the region that they want to go to
$2
$2
million.
million.
Right. So saying we want to support the budget is a good thing to do, but in fact, it sounds like if we continue to change the percentage of assessment in a way that we benefit, Amherst will be driven to cut because
Right.
they won't have another way. So it's not my job to figure out the other way. And that's why when I looked at the percentages and I thought about new growth and I thought
Right.
about where does that money go, that's their thing. And I certainly can believe that a new town council of 13 people have no idea how to meet this. And since the beginning, superintendents have said, if we make this change, if our assessment in Amherst goes up, we're going to have to cut the budget. That's been the only two, that's the black and white. And that's like, really? I don't know. I don't
Well,
know if there's another thing.
Well, I guess my reaction to that is that I think it's sort of one of the things that's happening is that it's being a little bit, like, in all honesty, it's being a little overstated what the impact to Amherst is by jumping to these different scenarios, getting closer and closer to statutory, right? I mean, it is, I understand that they're saying, we can only allow for a 1.5% increase in their assessment this year. I mean, jumping to 75% would be a 1.7% increase. Does that like represent a kind of a huge impact on Amherst? Not really. Wasn't it like $30,000? So I do think there's a little bit of like a disconnect, between the way Amherst in particular talks about this in these 4 town meetings and what the actual sort of like real world impact of making these changes is. And like, I don't really believe that an additional, 30 whatever some odd $1,000 to their assessment is like sort of beyond the kind of realm of like what can be imagined for the town,
The size of their
whereas
budget, it's nothing. But they're
Exactly,
arguing that they can't even go to the 45%. They're arguing that even that's too much. So when we talk about the $17,000 additional billings
Yeah.
that they'll have from 45 to 55, it sounds like
Yeah.
nothing to us. But they're
Yeah.
arguing that even the amount to stay at 45 is too much for them.
Yeah,
And
but it's
kind of hard
really,
to argue with a town about what they're capable of paying. And that frustrates me when people say, oh, Shutesbury can pay more. How do you know we can pay more? We have to
yeah.
respect, we have to some extent respect their assessment of their financial position.
Except
Right.
for Peter Demling did say that at 2 hours and 7, we can.
Yeah, but Peter Demling's on the school committee.
Right.
His interests, he doesn't know about Amherst
But
finance.
he related it to numbers, and I think that oftentimes people lost what the dollar factor was.
He related it to the same number that, we did and AJ just did, and that is the difference in the different methods, 45, 55, 65. But again, Amherst is arguing that even staying at 45 is
Yeah.
too hard for them.
With
So we can
that
talk
budget.
about 17,000
but I-
increments. They're saying the 200 something is too much.
Right.
I understand that. I understand they're saying that now, but it's like, it's a little hard to hear that after they already prepared initial guidance for Mike Morris that
1.5.
said, 1.5%. It's like,
Yeah.
you can't at this stage, you can't now go back and say, well,
Yeah.
actually we didn't mean 1.5%. We actually meant, it's like that, that's
That's
not
a
like
good point.
good faith.
That's an
Yeah.
excellent point. Yep.
But
should
isn't that
definitely-
because they have 13 newbies and a FinCom that isn't, I mean, it's interesting to watch the input each group has. And I think that the $2 million cut that was being floated was coming out of the council, not out of the FinCom.
Yeah, that was very striking to me about sort of how much of that meeting was, the first portion of the meeting was really spent on, the district having to sort of defend the overall size of its budget, and all of that sort of pressure to like revisit their budget, and are we really getting our value for this, and like all of that was coming from the Amherst town councilors, right? I mean,
Right.
I think
And some
which was
people, some Leverett, and I think one from Pelham. I think people in other towns were questioning the regional budget. I know one person in Leverett for sure was questioning the regional school budget. And
yeah, I get right. It was sort of started by the kind of Amherst
Council.
view, but
the Long
but
Meadow
you're right.
comment started it, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, which is kind of a crazy argument, but anyway.
Well, it shows that people aren't really up on it. But, the people who really understand this in Amherst are the chair of the financial council and the finance director has been immersed in this because he was the finance director at the regional school,
Right.
as we all know, Sean.
Yeah.
And those two guys understand this issue up and down from every angle. They know it. There's a lot of politics involved. It makes it very difficult. I think one of the things we can definitely show everybody, I really believe we need to show everybody, is that we can't support the 5-year rolling average no matter what, because it'll push us to the $25. And I think that's one thing that's got to be part of the education here. People need to understand that.
Yeah.
And stop pushing us towards it.
So I downloaded other things from the DLS and what do you call it? Tax rate.
The data bank. Yes.
Yeah. So the Amherst tax rate for 21 was $21.82. Leverett's $19.73. Pelham is $21.42, and Shutesbury's $22.61 because we put the free cash against it. So Leverett hasn't crested 20 yet. The other two are over $21 and we're over 22. But one of the things is some of the numbers of a percentage of the budget that's going into different areas. I ended up finding finally Amherst's 2020 numbers are finally in there. Schedule A is in, and their education is at 53. So actually that's stayed. Did that stay the same? Yeah, and Shutesbury's at 62%. And that stayed the same. So
Well,
so that was a little confusing to me because we got a reduced assessment. Why would our percentage stay the same?
well, that includes, doesn't that include the elementary school? Because I think that
Yeah.
goes up a little.
Yeah, yeah,
And remember, that number doesn't include health insurance for the
Yeah.
elementary school,
right.
OPEB for the elementary school. There are, there are residual costs created by the elementary school that are not in the elementary school budget, is my point.
Yeah, but that would have been consistent over time. Those aren't new factors. And so
No, that's true. I agree. I agree.
Shutesbury's been, as low as 62% and as high as, oh, it's stayed around 62%.
It's been consistent for a long time.
Yeah. And so I was surprised that when we're changing our assessment formula, that number isn't changing. So that's part of what I was thinking.
Susie, regarding the tax rate, and I know you've heard me say this before, I'm a broken record on this point at annual town meetings, and that is, the tax rate is really, it's the means for raising the funds. It's really a factor, right, of the amount of property values available to be taxed, divided into the amount of money that needs to be raised to come up with a rate that we can charge the property owners to collect the amount of money we need.
Mhm.
The way the state gauges affordability and tax costs when they're ranking towns worst to best, if you will, is the
Mhm.
average single family tax bill.
Mhm.
And I downloaded that information on February 4th for all the Commonwealth. And it's always the same. It's not always the same, but it's relatively the same. Amherst average taxpayer is paying $8,190 versus Shutesbury is paying $5,662. So
Mhm.
the tax, that just shows you how deceiving the tax rate is. Shutesbury's $5,662 puts us at the 152nd out of 322 towns. So we're like at the 47 percentile.
Mhm.
We used to be at the 33 percentile. Usually 130 towns paid more than we do, and the remaining 200 were below us, throwing out a number. And we came way down because of what we did with cash. And we're actually at the state average. The state average is, we're below the state average. The state average is at 6,192. Average single family tax bill in the Commonwealth is 6,192. We're paying 5,662. Up to this year, prior to this year, for like 5 years straight, we were within $10 of the state average year after year. We were always very close, and we've come way down. So I just want you to be aware, when we're talking to these towns, Amherst pays 8,200, Pelham pays 6,800, Leverett pays 6,400, Shutesbury pays 5,700. And so, for the other towns, we're already paying a pretty low tax amount. Amherst is just through the roof. So I can see when I look at this number why Andy fights the way he is.
Mhm.
They pay $2,500 more a year than we do. Now, the other day I dropped off my car in Palomado and I went for a little walk around the block and I walked through Amherst Woods.
And you
Yeah,
saw
there's a lot of people in that town that could care less what the property tax bill looks like.
Yeah.
They don't
Mhm.
feel it, but there are people that do.
I guess really to kind of focus our arguments, the relevant issue with respect to tax rates is the 25%, right, cap, and the very real danger that would. So it's not about, maybe it's not about sort of like what's
Not
what's
directly.
fair in terms of like one town versus the other, but just the basic reality that our hands will be tied if we and it won't be possible for us to support an assessment if we hit that that tax rate, right? I mean, that's
Yeah,
the
we won't
relevant
be
issue.
able to absorb increases in future
Right.
budgets.
Well, one person somewhere in this said that just shows us that education's being funded through a mechanism that doesn't work. And we are going to top it out. I guess there could be an argument that we might need to budget tighter so that we don't generate so much free cash. And we could do that without raising our tax rate.
Right.
And relative to the other towns, ours is at a totally different ballpark in terms of a percentage. And I believe that part of the reason we make the budget decisions we do is because we are a small town with unknowns that can topple things easily. So I don't
Yeah.
disagree with our process, but that is one place the use of our 25 per thousand is showing up different than other towns, but
It's hard to cry poverty when you've got $2 million sitting in the bank account. And
Right.
believe me, Leverett brings it up all the time. Leverett has brought it up multiple times. Julie Shively will bring it up. They'll
Right.
also bring up the fact that they get roughly 200,000 in chapter 78 for their elementary school, and we get roughly 600. We get 615, they get like 230. She brings that up every time as well. And we turn it back and say, well, yeah, there's a reason for that.
Right.
It's based on income and property values.
right. Yeah.
They don't want to hear that. They
Right.
talk about how Kittredge lives in their town and he skews the income number. And they argue that all the time. Smoke and mirrors. There's no question that they're, in better shape than we are.
So one thing where are we? An hour, a little more than an hour into it.
How about
Not
another
bad.
20 minutes?
One thing, like I don't want to see, or I think it's more helpful to see breakdowns of different options to break out the statutory method into the pieces, into the 3 component pieces. And maybe that is part of not shortcutting the discussion when we talk in terms of other towns. I do think that Becky's sort of putting all the chips right now on the DESE statutory workshop. But I think we could think about what information we want to compose that might also go along with that. I would like to find that I think 4 towns signed document on the statement of principles because the work of the ROG was to say these are the issues and these solutions address those issues. And I think those principles, those are the principles that got signed off. So
there was no document from the last working group. It essentially was a method we all agreed on with a handshake, and we brought it to the towns.
What year was, what, do you know when that was?
Not really.
Because the principle of, the statement of principles was in January of 2017, which is now long ago. And it's not clear whether it really got, I can see in Shutesbury's notes where it got edited and then agreed to and then signed. But if we have some kind of document.
That's the S10 method?
No, this is just called the statement of principles. It's not a method. And so it feels like it's a little bit of a founding rock if 4 towns signed it, because this part where we all disregard the past, it's like, no, that's not okay. There was a time when the work identified the principles that any solution needs to address. And I believe that's where the ability to pay got sort of codified into a principle. And that's different than enrollment. And so that's in January of 2017. And I asked Becky if I can ask central office for a copy of that. So I believe that might help the discussion at the DESE conference about or workshop around statutory, that the towns got to this point in the agreement. So whatever choice we make, it should fulfill these identified principles that, yeah, maybe it was only that group then, but these are principles that came out of the many years of research, and they're
So,
probably
Susie,
agreeable.
I know you're trying to track down that document, but do you actually know what those, like, is there in any of the minutes or anything that you looked at, are they actually laid out what
No,
those
they are
principles
not.
are? I
It's
see.
not even
Got it.
attached as a document, although
I see.
Becky thought maybe Linda Scott can find it in multi-town files. So,
I
but
see.
I can also go to the central office. And I
Yeah.
do believe it got signed by all four because I went over to Pelham and Leverett's minutes and looked
Yeah.
at stuff, and nobody else has any kind of government structure like we do. It's unbelievable how little they do. And
Uh-huh.
they did also reject it and then edit it. And then I believe they signed it. So that would be everybody.
And you can tell that from some minutes that you looked at in
Yeah.
their select
Mhm.
board meetings. I see.
Yeah. So,
That would be fascinating to see what those are. That would be very interesting.
and it would be
Yeah.
good to try to start our discussion there, and then
Yeah.
look at these methods and see what some of the proposals, and because the statutory is confusing, laying out how each one breaks it down would show the enrollment number being used in there, and that might help people understand that statutory means X. And then I would like to get
Right.
away from using 100% as some kind of magic number. And so if we can break out the pieces, maybe we can see.
Mhm.
One of the things that it seemed to come up to me was that statutory has some wild cards to it, and that might be why we don't go to 100%. That, it might be a balance to not to do like 75-25. It might help keep the statutory from being a force that wrecks things, or it would dampen its impact, and that might be a reasonable thing to be trying to get.
When you talk about a 50-50 method, as I said earlier, statutory benefits Shutesbury to the extreme, hurts Amherst to the extreme, vice versa with the 5-year rolling average. And it is really unfortunate that the other guys, everything is just minor. It's these two towns.
Mhm.
It puts us in a very difficult situation, and no doubt to some extent Amherst, but the point of the 50-50 method was the damage that a town inflicts by not going with the best method. That difference is just negligible or smaller. I won't call it negligible, but it's smaller.
Right.
And it's achievable, and it eliminates the distraction that AJ, you were talking about. We spend so much energy and have for the last 10 years on this issue. And it always is what wrecks whatever other plans we have.
Right.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
that's got to move up. I think that issue has got to sort of move up
Yeah.
the sort of ranking of, sort of concerns or principles that we're sort of negotiating from, is that I think we really do need to land on a method that towns can tolerate and live with for the foreseeable future.
That's right. An assessment method we can agree to and live with, so that we can focus more energies on the budget.
Yeah, and that was kind of the logic behind my suggestion earlier, that we actually sort of think of a different goalpost than we have been in the last few months, which is not 100% statutory, but this 75%. And I don't know if how agreeable our colleagues and the rest of our town would be, but I having kind of listened to that budget hearing and the 4 towns meeting, I'm definitely of the mindset that's a method that we can live with as a town. I don't know if that's how you guys feel, or if that's how the rest of our team would feel, but
I think the finance committee can make a coherent presentation to the town that will have more weight than just agitation. And so I do believe if we need to change our speaking point from 100% to something else, we do it with the goal of saying, this is something that all 4 towns can manage, and it can stop being such a football, and it can stop taking attention away from things that need to be attended to. And it has a balancing act that helps curb some of the excesses of either end of it. And I think the town can, I think the FinCom can present that to the town. The other piece that that occurred to me is enrollment as a factor in the beginning was X. Now it's choice, homeschooling. People's enrollments are all over the place by new forces that we haven't had to
Well,
deal
and they're
with
decreasing.
before.
The demographics, they're decreasing. You know, this generation behind me, you know, my kids are in their 30s. They're not having kids yet.
Yeah, right.
I had both mine by the time I was 30.
Yeah. So both, in all ways, the enrollment factor is starting to change the way the assessment's going. And Amherst may be more subject to enrollment drops due to the fact that people can choose to go somewhere else from a small, within the radius. Out here, we don't have as many choices. So we can never find a solution that freezes the factors. We need to find a solution that balances them enough so that we can all keep moving ahead and stay under $25 per thousand.
And we have two presentations. We have the presentation to the region, and we talk to them why the 75% method's a good method. It gets us, just over 45% is based on ability to pay, and the rest is enrollment. That's a pretty reasonable compromise, and I think very sellable. And it gives us a good chance of not inflicting a whole lot more damage on the budget, is kind of the argument we would make with them. And then to the town of Shutesbury, we would have to, because we do have a vocal group who doesn't understand why we wouldn't take anything other than the amounts that are provided for the benefit of Shutesbury. And we do need to convince them. Now, we're not going to convince them all. We just need to convince enough of them. And there is a constituency who has skin in the game directly through the parents. So I think if the 4 towns agreed to a 75% method and we presented it properly, I think we'd have no problem getting that to pass.
I think that's the key, George, though, is the last part of that, which is that I think if we can communicate that these are all of the different ways that where we as 4 towns end up sort of punishing our shared school district and the professionals that work in that district, these are the ways in which we hurt them and hurt the process of delivering, important educational services to kids by this fighting and process of kind of going back and forth. Like that to me is the key to convincing enough people in our town to accept a compromise position that is somewhere short of 100% modified statutory, but closer to that than where we are right now, maybe halfway in between or what have you. But that to me is the key, because I think if we allow people to communicate at town meeting or just in all of the kind of public advocacy that happens around this issue, to just say, we don't need to do anything. We've got our position. It's the default method. It's where we're gonna end up. The pressure is on the other towns to kind of come to us and convince us of an agreement. And it's not going to impact our kids, and it's not going to impact the budget. Like if we allow those messages to get out there and not be responded to, then I think I worry a little bit about how these votes play out. But
people who have been coming to annual town meetings and hearing this argument have heard a lot of our points about trying to be a good community, part of a community, a bigger community, and supporting education. There are a number of people who don't have kids in the school systems who certainly can appreciate the argument that we need to make, and will appreciate it. And there's going to be some people who are going to be vocal and angry, and that's, I've learned to live with that at this point.
And the other part of the argument that I think we have to figure out, and it might be in my notes already, is Shutesbury is overpaid by $2 million. Like, you say that and it just sets people off. It's like, well, wait a minute, what framework is that? Did we overpay? We had children there. They received services. Something has to get diffused in that piece, because it's going to come. That will be the piece That's the shortest sentence that'll come back over and over.
Yeah.
I don't actually see it in my notes. I don't know how we have thought to address it.
Yeah, we'll have to think about that. I mean, the bottom line is if we hadn't done that, the budget would be a lot lower in the regional school right now. But the
Yeah.
cuts would have been bigger over the years. We have to remind people, I know I do it a lot, is there have been a substantial number of cuts in this regional budget in
Right.
the last 10 years.
Right,
And people need to understand that that could have been a whole lot worse. It had Shutesbury not agreed to alternative methods.
right. And in fact, Mike Vinsky said at one of, I believe it was at one of the town meetings, or it's at least been at one of the select board meetings, that we can go to 100% statutory and it won't affect the budget. It's like, what are you saying that? We know it will produce a cut. And so that's the piece that gets unlinked. And that's right, George, that we can talk about. If we hadn't been moving along in this process, the cuts to our regional budget would have been severe, and the detriment to the education. And we need that also in terms of why we're not going to take a $2 million cut this year.
Yeah. And it's also, the other towns have a version of this same argument. They could say, Leverett could say, well, this is how much we're overspending above and beyond the regional agreement method by agreeing to these various compromises, right? I mean, so it's like they have an argument that they can make as well about sort of subsidizing or overspending by using the regional agreement as the baseline, whereas we're using 100% statutory as the baseline. And so I understand that argument and I understand why people are making it, but it's not as if there aren't like competing arguments that other towns can make that are very similar.
Well, they brought up the per pupil cost per town
Yeah.
to be differentiated, and why would Amherst need to pay more for a Shutesbury, because Shutesbury's paying this per kid? So
Yeah.
Because the answer is because the aid that comes into the region is higher per pupil for Shutesbury than it is the other towns. And that's I wish I had said that. I should have said that.
But that's not the only reason, George, because the other piece is we're trying to reach some kind of agreement that shares the cost of education. And the agreement needs to be in balance as best as possible.
Okay, good argument.
So
we're wrapping up here. What do you think the next steps are for our next meeting?
Right. So what I would like to see is a couple of sheets that say what statutory at 50-50, what statutory at 75-25, what exactly the components look like. And then I want to get the document that's a statement of principles. And I do want to continue, if you can do it, AJ, the time.
Yeah. Obviously that was just the start. So there's a lot of developments to add to that. So I could continue to work on that. That document you had where you excerpted all the select board minutes was very helpful. So yeah, I can go through that.
That breakdown that you're talking about, the first item, is something that has to be done by the finance director at the region.
Okay, so then we'd have to ask Becky for permission to do that.
Yeah, ask Becky to ask Doug Slaughter. I think it's the way it goes, but Becky will know.
Well,
Unless he's willing to actually share the Excel document, because
his calculations, and then we could do it. I could easily do it if I had his components. Yes, that's true, AJ.
Okay, I definitely got a funny vibe from him. And so I was thinking about this evolution. We had Sean Mangano, and now we have Doug. We had this superintendent, now we have that. They hold, like, the May 2018 town minutes statement that Sean made was not a statement I really saw anywhere else. It seemed to come out of, so he got to do something. He got to make a statement, and that was basically, it sounds like he's saying, to the statutory method in 5 phase-in years. Well, if you're doing 5 phase-in years and you call the first one 20%, then you're talking about 100% statutory. And it spit out there when I looked at what the archive at the regional school budget, it didn't say it quite the same way. So I don't know.
that there was ever any traction for any such method. Shutesbury came out in 50. I don't know what the context of that statement is.
Right, it was for FY19.
Yeah, I don't know. Probably just as an illustration more than anything else. I don't, because there was never any talk of going to a straight statutory. Pretty much, we brought it up in the beginning. Working groups were created, and it was always thrown out, and nobody was going to entertain 100% statutory.
Right. So it made me realize that the different speakers end up with representing different ideas, and communicating among all the parties falls apart. And therefore, if somebody says something, it becomes, it's taken in, especially at that level. That was the financial director saying that.
Well, a couple of things. First of all, Doug Slaughter used to be a selectman in the town of Amherst. Him and Andy have been working together forever. Those guys know each other really well. Doug Slaughter, Sean Magano lives in Belchertown, and he was working for the regional school. He was neutral. He came off as neutral to me. I mean, he definitely talked to Amherst a lot more than he talked to us. Who knows what those conversations were like, but Sean left me with the impression he was being impartial. I don't think we can expect that from Doug. I'm just flat out not going to trust Doug based on the fact that he lives in Amherst, based on the fact that he's been entrenched in Amherst politics for a long time.
And I did not see what was presented. There was no archived for town presentation for FY21, but we got their decision. So it's like, well, how did that decision get made? I couldn't find any notes that said how we got to the decision that, and of course this was the pandemic time, so everything got presented later, but I don't see it. And so then it made me feel that Doug might have just decided. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
All right. So if we get the principles, if we get the Excel sheet, and if we get a timeline, and we don't know what the DESE timing is going to be, but if we work at this now, then we might be ready with it. We might not. I don't know. We know how it's going to affect Shutesbury. We're not having our town meeting till June 12th. I don't know what Amherst is going to do. They don't have to do the COVID part. So they may want to have their budget numbers done sooner. So we'll have to look at that.
Yeah, we got to get DESE in here as soon as possible.
Yeah, so the time frame relative to both DESE and to town budget votes.
And we don't know that the other towns are going to be amenable to DESE coming in. We might get pushback on that. And like Becky said, we did that and Leverett didn't come.
Yeah.
And 2 people from Amherst came. I don't remember if somebody came from Pelham. I don't recall that John Trickey was there, so I don't know.
Right. And that was our invitation. She's hoping the Mike Morris invitation is more of a impact.
Point.
Right, and the Finance Council and the Regional School Committee will definitely have representation there. I think we can count on that, and that's huge. That's what we're talking about.
And so maybe if I get the principles, we can send those out to all of the parties ahead of the meeting, because it says this is what we're working towards.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, so I'll try to get that and then talk to Becky about distributing it to all the stakeholders before the meeting.
Yeah. And George, can you dig up that email you said you might have from DESE that lays out the process if a town does not approve the assessment method?
I can send you that memo.
Yeah.
You have that. Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you could share that, right, that would be great to see that.
Yeah, please do. I want to read that for sure.
Okay. Yeah, Becky was going to send it out, but she is a bazillion.
Yeah, I'm sorry, right, Susie, you mentioned you had it. Yep.
Yep. Okay. Good. So we know where we're at. Ha ha ha.
Yeah.
All
I don't
right.
know why Les Lachonic didn't tune in. He was gonna tune in, but he didn't.
Okay.
So, you know, we keep going. This is a recorded meeting. He can see it on record if he needs to.
Yep. Okay.
So
Oh
when-
yeah, I was supposed to tell you, this is a recording message.
I noticed.
And I can't erase it. Ha ha ha.
Yeah.
Okay. Take care.
All right.
When's our next meeting?
Well, I don't know. I think it depends on how the DESE thing goes. So we each
Yeah.
have some tasks to work at. And if you feel like you want to have a meeting again, let me know.
Okay.
No,
And we-
I'll let you decide. See, we'll communicate like we did. Although we got to be careful about how we communicate, don't we?
You can communicate information. You can communicate resources. You can't communicate
Decisions.
discussion or
Decisions.
opinions or decisions. So I felt like I was handing out information. I wasn't telling you how to interpret it. The only one I felt was slightly interpretive was the pointing out what pages some of the percentages were, you know, out of the 27 pages that you
Right.
have to look through. But I wasn't telling you what to think about that.
Right. But in these meetings, obviously, since it's a posted meeting, we're allowed to
Oh yeah,
take positions on these issues and express that. Yeah.
and it's recorded.
Yeah, but we do need to be careful in emails. I can see myself easily making a
Yeah.
statement that can be interpreted as, you know,
Right.
Yeah.
a
Well,
discussion.
I
That's-
did one
that's a good reminder.
that I didn't send to AJ, the one about where's the smoking gun. That was more, that was between you and I in a non-forum email.
Right.
And yeah, I'll maybe make sure
Well-
and don't pass this on.
Any two of us talking is a quorum.
Yes, actually, that was when I was still on the FinCom, not just the subcommittee, actually. But yeah, you're right. Here we go.
All right.
And then I guess we should probably just share a little bit of our discussion Tuesday night at FinCom, right? Just let people know that we met and kind of just maybe
I think
summarize some.
I think we want to minimize what we bring there.
Okay.
Because it will just become the topic, and we have many.
Yeah.
That's why it's just.
Yeah, you're right.
We'll
So
end
we'll
up
just say,
spending
yeah,
20
we're
minutes
meeting.
talking about this.
Yeah.
We're meeting
Yeah.
and we're working on getting information. Bye.
Okay. Good point. Yep.
Okay.
I agree.
All right.
All righty.
Okay.
Take care, everyone.
Take
Enjoy the
care.
rest of your day.
Yep.
All right. You
Bye-bye.
too. Bye.